Hey, so this is, right. Oh, there you are. So this is a farmhouse accent cabinet that I recently built. And in this video, I'm going to show you step by step how I built it. So if you like it, you can build one yourself. First, let's talk about materials. And what you'll need is a 8-foot long 2x4 for the legs, one 8-foot long 1x2 for the crosses or X's, whatever you call those. I need a couple of 6-foot long 1x6s, which you'll use to rip down into various sizes for the rails. One 8-foot long 2x10 for the top here. A couple of 2-foot by 4-foot sheets of 3/4 inch plywood that you'll use for the interior of the cabinet. And then a 2-foot by 4-foot 1/4 inch sheet of plywood that you'll use for the backing. And then just paint, stain, polyurethane, cabinet hardware, etc. All total, if you don't have any of this stuff laying around in the garages, scrap, you're looking at about $125 for materials. But as you'll see in the video, I had extras laying around for some of these that I was able to use. A couple of other things of note. The top, obviously, if you don't want a beefy 1.5 inch top, you could just go with a 1x material, 1x10, so that it's not quite so thick. Personally, I kind of like the beefiness of it. And then for the rails, I mentioned I used the 1x6s for that, and then just ripped them down into various sizes. I forget exactly, I think it was 1.5 and 2 or 2.5 for the bottom. So if you don't have a table saw, or you just don't want to be bothered with ripping that material, you can always go with dimensional lumber that doesn't require cutting. So a 1x2 and a 1x3 for the bottom, what have you. So yeah, you got a few options for how you kind of approach that, but generally speaking, any option is going to work for you. So let's go ahead and get into the build, and we'll see how to do it. The first step is to get rid of the rounded edges on the 2x4s. To do that, I run the board through the planer on both sides, which takes it down to a thickness of about 1.25 inches. And if you don't have a planer, you could rip the edges with a table saw. Next, I can start cutting down the pieces I'll need for the side assembly. And I'm using the 1x6 board, which I will later rip into thinner pieces. And for the side assembly, I need 8-inch long sticks. So I make 2 cuts from the 1x6, and I then make 23-inch long cuts of the 2x4. Once that's done, I can take my 8-inch long pieces over to the table saw and rip down 2 strips that are 1.5 inches wide and 2 strips that are 2.5 inches wide. Next, I lay out my boards on the table and start laying out how I want each side assembly to look. And happy with that, I can start adding the pocket hole screws to all 4 of the 8-inch pieces. With the pocket hole screws done, I can start getting the pieces into the clamps to ensure that nothing shifts. And once I've checked to ensure that everything is square, I simply screw everything together. And with the basic side assembly done, I can start working on the X's, I guess if that's what you call them, that will fit inside each of them. And rather than trying to measure the cuts, which can be tricky given the tight space, I just set the piece over the 1x2 and make the marks for my angled cuts. With both cuts made, it's time to work on the half lap joints. And to do that, I set the pieces into the side assembly and mark where I need the joints to be cut. The cleanest way to do this is with a sliding miter saw with a stop, but I don't have that. So I had to do the cuts on the table saw using the miter gauge. So I set the blade to 3/8 of an inch, which is half the width of the board, and then made several passes until I had the cuts that I needed. Once that's done, I just clean up the joints with a chisel and then start gluing them into place. And the joints were nice and tight, so I didn't need to worry about pin nailing them in place. With the side assemblies done, I can start working on the pieces I'll need to connect the two together. And these need to be 32.5 inches long, so I cut those pieces from the 1x6, and then using the same approach as before, I take them over to the table saw, rip them down to 1.5 inch pieces and 2.5 inch pieces, 2 of each. After I've added the pocket hole screws for each of those, I mark where I need the 2 bottom pieces, which is 2 inches from the bottom, and then secure them into place. Before I put the top 2 stretchers on, I finish up the bottom shelf, and I cut a scrap of piece of wood about 1 inch wide that I can attach to the inside of the bottom stretchers. And then I'll use that as a support for the plywood shelf, so I can make sure that these are mounted 3/4 of an inch from the top of the stretcher, and then screw them into place since this won't be visible. Then I cut a piece of plywood to fit inside the lower frame and attach that to those inner support pieces using glue and a few finishing nails. And once that's in place, I can come back with a sander to make sure the side stretchers and the plywood are perfectly flush. With the bottom shelf done, I can install the top 2 stretchers and the frame is pretty much done. And now I can start working on creating the inner box. So for that, I cut down 2 pieces of plywood that will fit inside the rails. And after the cuts are made, I add some pocket hole screws for attaching them to the box. 2 along the bottom, on the inside, and 1 on each side near the top. I use a hand clamp to hold the top of the board in place to prevent it from sliding while I screw it in, and I check for square. Once everything looks good, I can screw that in place and repeat for the second side. For the back of the cabinet portion, I didn't have a full sheet of 1/4 inch plywood laying around, and since this won't really be seen and I'm too lazy to make a Home Depot run, I cut 2 pieces of 1/4 inch plywood that will fill the area, and I nail those into place. Now the final step for the main cabinet is to cap off the exposed plywood edges on the inner cabinet. And I had some small scrap pieces of maple laying around, so I planed those down to the proper thickness and then glued those into place. And now it's time to start working on the cabinet door. And for that, I ripped some 1.5 inch wide pieces and cut them to length. The inside of the door will be 1/4 inch plywood, and I wasn't really feeling adventurous for how this would get assembled, so I marked a 1/2 inch outline on all of the pieces, Then using the router, I made a 1/4 inch deep groove on the inside of the door frames for the flat plywood to sit in. Once that's done, I can glue up the door frame. And while that's drying, I take a scrap piece of plywood and cut out the piece that I'll need for the inside of the door. After the plywood has been glued into place, I can finally start painting. Not that I was excited about that. Painting is by far my least favorite part of any project, and always more time consuming than I expect. So for both the door and the cabinet, I used a roller for as much as I could, but it was still a slow process. Eventually though, after about 3 coats, painting was done. The next step is to work on the cabinet top. And a few weeks ago, I'd glued up some 2x10s that were cut down to 16.5 inches wide. And I was originally going to use these for floating shelves, but I ended up going a different direction on that project, which meant I could reuse these for the top. So I cut down a 36-inch long piece and then sanded it down to a nice finish and added Jacobian stain. Once the stain had dried, I applied 2 coats of matte finish polyurethane and the top was ready to go. Before I can attach that though, I need to install the cabinet door. And I start by routing out the areas where the hinges will go and touching up that area that won't be covered by the hinge. Then it's just a matter of mounting the door to the frame. Once that's done, I can go ahead and install the door hardware, and I installed a magnetic door catch. Finally, the last piece is to attach the top. And for that, I used my Forstner bit to cut in some 3/8 inch holes from the underside of the cabinet rails. I attached the top then with 2-inch screws, plugged the holes with the dowels, and after a quick touch up of paint, the cabinet is done. So that's it. That is the Farmhouse accent cabinet build. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and hope you like the finished product. If you do choose to build one for yourself, good luck. And if you have any questions or comments during the build, shoot me a message and I'll be happy to offer any advice I can. Otherwise, thanks for watching and we'll see you on the next build.